I'll pay $1 million just for her to have my child. No strings attached. No love. No coming back." The gavel slammed down, echoing like a sentence passed in a courtroom. The young woman in the white dress didn't lift her head. She only tightened her grip on the crumpled photograph in her hand. A photo of her little boy. Her lips pressed into a firm line, her back straight. But her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. No one in that room knew. Tonight, she wasn't selling her body. She was selling her pain, her pride, and the last piece of her heart, to give her sick child one last chance at life. And the man who bought her, cold, powerful, unreadable, had no idea that this woman would become the one person who could do what no one else ever had. Save his soul, with a kind of love he never believed was real. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. That part of South Los Angeles never looked like a home. It was a patchwork of cracked walls, boarded-up windows, and sirens that echoed like a broken lullaby. The smell of burnt oil and desperation lingered in the air, like it had soaked into the very concrete. Lila Martinez, 26, single mother, hadn't had time to cry in years. She juggled 3 jobs, flipping burgers before dawn, scrubbing floors in office buildings after dark, and folding laundry in between. Not because she wanted to, because she had no choice. Her son, Eamon, was 5. Big brown eyes, sweet crooked smile, and lungs so fragile that the doctor had stopped using hopeful words months ago. That morning, Lila sprinted through 3 blocks holding Eamon in her arms, his tiny face wrapped in a threadbare scarf as he wheezed through another coughing fit. Every breath he took was a stab to her chest. But what broke her wasn't his illness. It was the paper the doctor handed her. If he's not hospitalized within a week, the damage to his lungs could be permanent. Back at the room they called home, a single dingy space behind an abandoned auto shop, Lila unlocked the door and stepped onto warped floorboards that groaned like they, too, were giving up. On the rickety table between unpaid bills was a red envelope. Eviction notice. Deadline. 5 days. She sat silently on the peeling linoleum floor, Eamon curled up beside her, already dozing off from exhaustion. She looked at his face, so peaceful, so unaware. This little boy, who never had his own bed, never had a birthday party, never asked for more than what she could give. He still smiled every morning, because his mom was there. But now, she might not be for much longer. That night, her elderly neighbor Mrs. Esther, a quiet widow with kind eyes, slipped a folded note under her door. No explanation, just an address, a time, and one line written in trembling cursive. "Don't judge yourself for the things you do to save your child." Lila showed up. A limo, black, gleaming out of place in this world, took her through winding roads into the hills. It stopped in front of a mansion she couldn't even dream about. Inside was gold, marble, chandeliers, laughter, but none of it felt human. This wasn't a party. It was an auction. She wasn't introduced by name, just a number. Number 23. They told her, "Don't speak, don't look at the bidders, just smile, just be quiet." Lila did as told, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was beyond fear. There was only one thing left inside her, a reason. Amon. Her number was called. She stepped onto the stage, trembling in her cheap white dress. In her coat pocket she clutched the only thing that mattered, the photo of her son laughing, holding a red balloon. The room buzzed with murmurs and appraising glances. Then a voice cut through the noise. $1 million. The room fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to the man in the back row, Karim Al-Fayed, a billionaire, ruthless, private, unshakable. The kind of man who didn't ask. He decided. And tonight he decided to buy Lila, not out of desire, not out of lust, but because he needed a surrogate, to fulfill a clause in his family's will, a child, nothing more. Lila stepped off the stage like a ghost dot. She didn't look back. She didn't cry. She only whispered in her heart, "Please, let this buy my son another chance to live. I don't need anything else." She had no idea that the man who bought her body would be the one to heal her soul. And he didn't know that the woman he tried to forget would become the one person he could never let go. The mansion was stunning, but it was never meant to feel like home. High ceilings, polished marble floors, and windows that framed the desert like a painting. Everything looked perfect, sterile, as if love had never dared to live here. Lila stepped inside, her fingers trembling slightly against the hem of her sleeve. She was led to a private room with muted tones, sleek furniture, and no trace of personal warmth. A woman named Amira, a housekeeper with gentle eyes, showed her around and left without saying much. Then the door opened again. Kareem, tailored black suit, silent steps, eyes sharp as glass dot. He didn't sit, didn't smile. Instead, he laid a document on the table between them. "This is the contract," he said, voice calm, rehearsed. "You will undergo fertility treatment immediately. Once the child is born, you will receive the final payment. You will leave. No visits, no names, no trace of you in the child's life." Lila's heart clenched. Her fingers brushed the pages, her vision already blurred. But she said nothing. She couldn't afford the luxury of protest. "Do you understand?" Kareem asked, his gaze unreadable. She nodded. He handed her a pen. "Then sign." And she did. That was the beginning of their arrangement. Cold, calculated, inhuman. To him, she was a means to an end. To her, it was survival. The days that followed were painfully quiet. Kareem kept his distance, always polite, always formal. Meals were taken separately. Conversations were brief. He rarely spoke unless it was about appointments, medications, or results. "I don't need companionship," he told her once, when she tried to thank him for a small kindness. "I need a child, that's all." His voice never wavered, his eyes never softened. But Lila was hiding something, a secret she kept locked inside her heart. Amen, her son. She had never told Kareem about him. How could she? The contract demanded absolute detachment. And Kareem made it very clear. He didn't want entanglements, only control. But late at night, when the house was silent, she'd hold her phone in the dark, whispering to her neighbor, checking on Eamon. "Tell him I love him. Tell him I'll be home soon." Each lie felt like a wound. Each breath of her son over the phone was a thread pulling her further apart. Tensions began to rise. Kareem had rules for everything. No visitors. No calls outside the staff's knowledge. No wandering without permission. "Why can't I go to the gardens alone?" Lila once asked. Kareem looked at her coolly. "Because this isn't a vacation. You're here to fulfill a role, not to explore." "I'm not a prisoner," she bit back. "You're under contract," he replied. "Don't confuse that with freedom." The words cut like ice. Lila stormed back to her room, biting her lip to hold back tears. She wanted to scream, but she didn't. She couldn't. Yet for all his coldness, Kareem wasn't cruel, just emotionally absent, detached, as if something inside him had frozen years ago and never thawed. Lila noticed it in his silences, the way he stared at the fireplace, unblinking, the way he walked the halls alone at night, hands clasped behind his back like a man pacing the edges of a life too empty to feel still. He insisted on control, of everything. When she mentioned wanting to call someone, he said, "That's not part of the agreement." When she expressed wanting fresh air, "I'll arrange an escort." When she said she felt suffocated, "You're not here to be comfortable. You're here to complete the task." "And what am I to you?" she finally snapped one evening, voice shaking. Kareem didn't even blink. "I don't need a woman, I need a womb." That was the line, the one she couldn't unhear. Lila stood there, frozen, the words slamming into her chest like a blow. She walked out, not waiting for permission. In her room, she cried for the first time in weeks. Not because she was hurt, but because she realized she wasn't a person to him. She was a function, a vessel. And somewhere along the way, she had begun to hope he might see more. She was wrong. But deep inside that mansion of glass and steel, cracks were beginning to form. And Kareem, though he'd never admit it, was starting to notice the very thing he thought he didn't need. Her presence, her quiet resistance, her gentleness with the staff, her laughter, rare but real. He didn't like how it made him feel, because feeling anything was dangerous. The desert sun slipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the stone walls of the mansion. Inside, the air was cool, still, and heavy with silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. Lila wandered the hallways with quiet steps. It was late, too late for staff to be moving. Her bare feet tapped softly against the marble floors as she passed towering windows and untouched sculptures. She wasn't looking for anything. Not really. Until she heard it. A sound. unexpected and strangely human in this place built for order and wealth. A piano. The notes drifted softly down the hallway, tentative at first, like someone playing from memory rather than sheet music. It wasn't perfect. A few keys were missed and the rhythm wavered, but there was something painfully beautiful about it. Lila followed the music like a thread pulling her closer until she reached the doorway of the music room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it gently, just enough to peek inside. There, illuminated by the warm glow of a single-floor lamp, sat Kareem. He was alone, hunched slightly over the grand piano. The keys under his fingers looked small against his hands built for contracts and negotiations, not for tenderness. And yet, tenderness was what she saw. He didn't notice her. His eyes were focused somewhere far beyond the room, somewhere in a memory Lila couldn't reach. The melody floated from his fingertips, delicate, haunting, a lullaby of some kind, familiar but not to her. And then he stopped, as if a memory had choked the final note from his hands. "You play beautifully." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it startled him. Kareem turned to find her standing there, unguarded, hesitant. He looked like a man caught doing something he shouldn't, but not angry, just exposed. "My mother taught me," he said after a long pause. His voice was different, lower, quieter. Before she passed, Lila didn't speak. She only stepped farther into the room, her eyes resting on the piano, then on him. He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask. But in that moment, something shifted between them, something unspoken, but deeply felt. The next morning, just as the first light crept in through the linen curtains, Lila opened her door to find a small surprise, a porcelain teacup, still warm, jasmine, her favorite. There was no note, no sound in the hallway, just steam rising slowly in the quiet. She picked it up with both hands, her heart catching in her throat. She hadn't told anyone about her preference. Only once, in passing, while walking through the garden with Amira, she had mentioned that jasmine reminded her of home. Only Kareem had been within earshot. He hadn't said a word that night, but he'd heard her. Later that afternoon, Lila sat on the edge of the fountain near the east garden. The sky above her was a pale blue, streaked with soft orange. A peaceful quiet surrounded her, until a tiny sound broke it. A faint chirp. She looked down and saw it. A small bird, no larger than her palm, lying beneath a manicured hedge. Its wing was bent, and it trembled with each breath. Without hesitation, she gathered it gently, cradling it in the folds of her shawl. "It fell," she murmured. A voice answered behind her. "It won't survive," Kareem said, walking toward her from the path. She didn't turn, just kept her eyes on the bird. "Not unless someone helps it," she replied. Kareem paused, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a while, watching her tend to the tiny creature as if it were something precious. Then, without another word, he walked away. But he looked back once. She didn't see it. That evening, the staff served dinner in the formal dining room. Kareem didn't usually eat with her, but tonight, he appeared. Lila was already seated at the far end of the long table, unsure of why the extra place had been set. He sat across from her, not saying much. For a while, there was only the quiet clinking of silverware on porcelain. "How's the bird?" he asked suddenly. Lila looked up, surprised. "Still breathing," she answered. "Barely." He nodded, then returned to his food. But that one question, small, unexpected, was the first time he'd spoken to her without obligation. In the days that followed, their paths crossed more often. Not deliberately, just naturally. Sometimes they found themselves in the same room, reading, walking, sitting in silence. No words needed, no expectations. Once in the library, she reached for a book at the same time he did. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. He stepped aside, allowing her to take it. Their eyes met briefly. Something fluttered in her chest. She saw it then. The loneliness he carried so well, it had become part of his identity. She wondered how many years he had gone without someone asking how he was, or caring whether he'd eaten, or offering him jasmine tea dot. He noticed things about her too, like the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, or how she laughed, only when she thought no one was listening, or how she sang lullabies in a language he didn't recognize when tending to the little bird. And it unnerved him, because he wasn't supposed to feel anything. This was supposed to be a transaction, a contract, not a connection. And yet, the lines between them began to blur, slowly, softly, like ink spreading through warm water. One night, while the house was asleep, Lila stood at the window of her room, looking out into the courtyard. Behind her, the tiny bird stirred in its box beside the fireplace. A knock at the door. She opened it to find Kareem standing there, holding a small cloth packet. "Bandages," he said, avoiding her eyes. "For the wing." Lila took them, their fingers grazing again. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, turned to leave, then paused. "Let me know if it survives," he said, and walked away. She closed the door softly behind him, then leaned against it, hand to her chest, heartbeat like thunder. Neither of them said what they were feeling, but in the spaces between their words, in the tea, in the bird, in the music, something fragile and unexpected had taken root. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was no longer just survival, it was possibility. And in a house built on rules and contracts, that was the most dangerous feeling of all. For the night. Moonlight poured in through the tall glass windows, casting silver shadows across the polished floors. The kind of night where everything feels suspended, where silence feels less like peace or a scream. Kareem was restless. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the music still lingering in his head from the last time his fingers touched the piano, or maybe it was the woman. She had disrupted the rhythm of his carefully controlled world, like a grain of sand inside a watch, small but capable of throwing everything off balance. He found himself walking, nowhere in particular, past the library, toward the guest wing. He paused in front of her door. It was slightly ajar. He wasn't spying, not intentionally, but the soft flicker of light inside pulled him forward like gravity. Her room was empty. The bed was neatly made. A shawl hung gently on the back of a chair. Beside the fireplace was a small wooden box, the kind one might keep memories in, or secrets. And then he saw it. A photo, faded, edges bent, lying face up on the floor as if it had fallen while being moved. A little boy, no older than 5. His smile bright, his eyes familiar in a way that made Kareem's blood run cold. He picked it up slowly, like it might burn him. "This is her child," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The truth landed like a punch to the chest. She had lied. Everything, her silence, her distance, her sorrowful glances at the phone. It all made sense now. The door creaked. Lila stepped inside. She froze the moment she saw him standing there. Her eyes dropped to his hands, to the photograph, to the secret she had kept buried. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but her face had already crumbled. Kareem turned toward her, his expression a storm barely contained. His voice trembled with rage and disbelief. "You lied to me!" "Kareem, please! From the beginning!" he shouted, the sound of it cracking through the quiet like thunder. "You said nothing about having a child. You stood on that stage, signed that contract, and never once mentioned this." He held the photo up, his hand shaking. "Is this your son?" Lila's eyes filled instantly, her face pale. "Yes," she whispered. "His name is Eamon." Kareem stepped back, as if the name itself had struck him. "You brought a child into this arrangement? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Lila clutched the edge of the table to keep from falling apart. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "I did it for him." Kareem turned away, fists clenched, jaw tight. "Don't justify it. You used me." "No!" she cried. "I was out of options, Kareem. I had eviction notices on my door, my son was sick, and I had no one left, no family, no help, nothing. You think I wanted this life?" He said nothing, just stared at the fire. "If I hadn't done it," her voice cracked, "he would have died." For a moment the room went still again. Kareem stood facing the flames, his back to her, but inside him something had shattered. He felt betrayed, yes, but beneath the anger, beneath the bruised pride, was something he couldn't deny. recognition. Because in her desperation, in her fear, in the brutal choices she'd made, he saw a reflection of himself. The boy he used to be, alone. Afraid, forced to carry too much. He turned back to her. But his voice was cold, You should have told me. Lila looked up at him, her cheeks wet with tears. Would it have mattered? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her and left the room. And as the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, Lila collapsed onto the chair, her face buried in her hands. The photo lay between them on the floor, the truth that had finally surfaced, and now stood between them like a wall of glass. That night, neither of them slept. He stared at the ceiling of his private suite, eyes wide open, heart unfamiliar with this kind of ache. She sat by the fireplace, clutching the small box of memories she had tried so hard to keep hidden. Outside, the desert winds howled. Inside, two people, so different, so damaged, lay just rooms apart, wondering if the bridge between them had finally collapsed, or if it was just beginning to be built. The soft hum of the car engine faded into the distance. Lila stood frozen in front of the grand estate, the desert wind gently tugging at the hem of her coat. The iron gates closed behind her with a quiet finality, and in that moment, she felt the weight of two worlds pressing on her chest. She had just returned from seeing her son. Eamon had wrapped his little arms around her neck like he always did, giggling through stories of school, asking when she'd be home for good. She had smiled, nodded, promised and then she had lied, again. Now back in this palatial home of glass and silence, she felt like a ghost, present in body, but nowhere in spirit. Kareem stood in the doorway as she entered the foyer. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his forearms, his tie slightly loosened. He looked less like the cold billionaire she had met weeks ago, and more like a man who hadn't slept in days. "How was he?" he asked, voice low, controlled. Lila didn't look at him. She didn't have the strength. "He's fine." That was all she said before walking past him, her heels clicking faintly on the marble floor, echoing in the emptiness behind her. From that day on, a wall of silence began to grow between them. It wasn't built with shouting or slammed doors. It was crafted from hesitation, half-finished sentences, and unspoken questions. They moved through the mansion like strangers now, two bodies occupying the same space yet carefully avoiding collision. In the mornings, Lila sat in the sunroom alone, sipping tea she didn't finish. Her eyes wandered out to the horizon, where the sand met the sky, where dreams felt farther away than ever. She no longer sang while tending to the garden. She no longer asked about the books in the library. She no longer entered the music room at night. Kareem noticed every detail, every shift. She wasn't angry, not outwardly, but the way she moved, the way she breathed. It was like she had quietly closed a door he hadn't realized she was keeping open. He had given her space, or so he thought. He hadn't touched her since the contract, hadn't demanded anything beyond the agreement. But now that very distance, once his shield, felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. He left a cup of tea outside her room the next morning. No note, no words. Just jasmine and honey, her favorite. Lila opened the door, saw it, stared at it, then gently shut the door again. She didn't need tea. She needed trust, and she didn't know if she had it anymore. That evening, the mansion was still as ever. The staff moved quietly, sensing the shift in atmosphere, an invisible tension that wrapped around every corridor like fog. Lila sat in the library, her fingers grazing the edges of a worn book, but she didn't turn the pages. She simply stared into the fireplace, the flames flickering across her tired eyes. Kareem stood in the hallway, watching her from the shadows. He didn't know how to approach her anymore. He wanted to ask how she was sleeping, if she needed anything, if she hated him. But the words stuck in his throat. He had mastered power, not intimacy. He had built empires, but not bridges. And now, with this woman, this quiet, hurting woman, he was completely lost. Dinner that night was almost unbearable. She sat across from him, eating in silence, her fork barely touching the food. The candle between them cast soft light, but there was no warmth in it. "Lila," he finally said, unable to take the silence any longer. "I don't want this distance between us." She didn't look up. just kept cutting into the chicken she wouldn't eat. "You created it," she said quietly. "That's not fair, isn't it?" she snapped, her voice rising, but only slightly, not with fury, but with pain. He fell silent. She set her fork down slowly. "You say you don't want distance, Kareem, but everything about this place, this arrangement, it's all built on control, on what you allow. I have no say, no voice. Even when I beg to see my son, it comes with rules." She finally met his eyes. "You want closeness, but only on your terms." Kareem didn't speak. He didn't know how to defend himself because in that moment he wasn't sure she was wrong. He had bought her silence. But he had no idea how to earn her trust. Later that night, Lila stood on her balcony under the desert stars. The wind was cool against her skin, but she didn't move. She just stared into the dark, arms wrapped around herself. Inside, Kareem sat at the grand piano in the music room, his fingers idle on the keys. He wanted to play. He wanted to create something beautiful, for her, for them. But the silence between them had seeped into him too. And for the first time in years he didn't know how to find the notes. They were under the same roof, breathing the same air, longing for the same thing. But both too wounded, too unsure, too afraid to take the first step. The night air in the city was soft, almost forgiving, as Kareem sat in the back of his tinted car, parked discreetly across from an old apartment building. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him, alone, with something tightening in his chest he couldn't quite name. Through the cracked window of a second-floor unit, dim light poured into a modest room. Kareem adjusted the binoculars in his hand, his fingers tense. He hadn't intended to stay long. He only wanted to see the child once, to confirm the truth, and then leave. But what he saw stopped him cold. Inside the little room, a boy no older than 5 sat cross-legged on a worn-out mattress. His cheeks were rosy, his hair tousled from a long day. Beside him, an elderly woman, the neighbor perhaps, helped him into his pajamas. "Can I kiss Mommy goodnight?" the boy asked sweetly. She nodded, smiling warmly. The child reached under his pillow and pulled out a faded photograph, creased and curled at the edges. It was Lila, smiling, holding him as a baby. He pressed the picture gently to his lips. "Good night, Mama. I love you." Kareem's breath caught. He wasn't prepared for this. Not the quiet intimacy of it. Not the innocence. Not the way the boy looked at that photo like it was his entire world. Something inside Kareem shifted. For years he had lived in a fortress of rules, order, and cold pragmatism. Contracts defined relationships. Control protected him from pain. But watching that little boy kiss a photo, because that was all he had, was like watching a reflection of himself at that age. Only now, Kareem saw it from the outside. He returned to the mansion just past midnight. The halls were silent. The moonlight filtered through the high windows, washing the walls in silver and shadow. In his study, Kareem opened the locked drawer where the contract lay. He sat down. No hesitation, no second thoughts. He took out a pen and began rewriting everything. The next morning, Lila awoke to find a single sheet of paper folded neatly on her nightstand. Her name was handwritten at the top in Kareem's precise, angular script. She unfolded it slowly. As her eyes scanned the page, her hands began to tremble. Her name, her son's name, a new agreement. There were no more ultimatums, no more expiration dates. Just a simple statement. She would have full custody of her child, and if she wished, they could both live here, together, as family. At the bottom, Kareem had signed his name, and beneath it, one line in his own handwriting: "I don't want another child to grow up motherless, like I did." Lila stood in the doorway of the music room later that evening, the contract still clutched in her hand. Kareem was seated at the piano, back straight, fingers resting on the keys but unmoving. He didn't hear her enter. Not until she spoke, softly, barely more than a breath. "You saw him, didn't you?" Kareem turned, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded once. "I didn't mean to intrude, I just needed to see." Lila stepped inside, her eyes searching his face. "Why did you do this? Why change the contract?" He looked at her for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Because I finally understood what it means to be alone in the dark, and to reach for someone who isn't there. And because he deserves better." You both do. Silence hung between them. Not heavy like before, but tender. Like the pause between heartbeats. Lila blinked away tears, not from sadness, but something else. Gratitude, relief, the start of something new. She crossed the room slowly, sat beside him on the piano bench. Their shoulders touched. No words needed. In that moment, something shifted. Not because they had resolved everything, but because for the first time the distance between them wasn't silence. It was trust. The night air in the city was soft, almost forgiving. As Kareem sat in the back of his tinted car, parked discreetly across from an old apartment building. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him, alone, with something tightening in his chest he couldn't quite name. Through the cracked window of a second-floor unit, dim light poured into a modest room. Kareem adjusted the binoculars in his hand, his fingers tense. He hadn't intended to stay long. He only wanted to see the child once, to confirm the truth, and then leave. But what he saw stopped him cold. Inside the little room, a boy no older than 5 sat cross-legged on a worn-out mattress. His cheeks were rosy, his hair tousled from a long day. Beside him, an elderly woman, the neighbor perhaps, helped him into his pajamas. "Can I kiss Mommy goodnight?" the boy asked sweetly. She nodded, smiling warmly. The child reached under his pillow and pulled out a faded photograph, creased and curled at the edges. It was Lila, smiling, holding him as a baby. He pressed the picture gently to his lips. "Good night, Mama. I love you." Kareem's breath caught. He wasn't prepared for this. Not the quiet intimacy of it. Not the innocence. Not the way the boy looked at that photo like it was his entire world. Something inside Kareem shifted. For years he had lived in a fortress of rules, order, and cold pragmatism. Contracts defined relationships. Control protected him from pain. But watching that little boy kiss a photo, because that was all he had, was like watching a reflection of himself at that age. Only now, Kareem saw it from the outside. He returned to the mansion just past midnight. The halls were silent. The moonlight filtered through the high windows, washing the walls in silver and shadow. In his study, Kareem opened the locked drawer where the contract lay. He sat down. No hesitation. No second thoughts. He took out a pen and began rewriting everything. The next morning, Lila awoke to find a single sheet of paper folded neatly on her nightstand. Her name was handwritten at the top in Kareem's precise, angular script. She unfolded it slowly. As her eyes scanned the page, her hands began to tremble. Her name, her son's name, a new agreement. There were no more ultimatums. No more expiration dates. Just a simple statement. She would have full custody of her child, and if she wished, they could both live here, together, as family. At the bottom, Kareem had signed his name, and beneath it, one line in his own handwriting: "I don't want another child to grow up motherless. Like I did." Lila stood in the doorway of the music room later that evening, the contract still clutched in her hand. Kareem was seated at the piano, back straight, fingers resting on the keys but unmoving. He didn't hear her enter, not until she spoke, softly, barely more than a breath. "You saw him, didn't you?" Kareem turned, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded once. "I didn't mean to intrude, I just needed to see." Lila stepped inside, her eyes searching his face. "Why did you do this? Why change the contract?" He looked at her for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Because I finally understood what it means to be alone in the dark, and to reach for someone who isn't there. He deserves better. You both do." Silence hung between them, not heavy like before, but tender, like the pause between heartbeats. Lila blinked away tears, not from sadness. Gratitude, relief, the start of something new. She crossed the room slowly, sat beside him on the piano bench. Their shoulders touched. No words needed. In that moment, something shifted. Not because they had, but because for the first time the distance between them wasn't silence. It was trust. The air in the mansion had shifted. That morning, Lila had felt an odd pressure in her lower back. She brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the weight of the pregnancy nearing its end. She had spent the day slower than usual, sipping tea on the terrace, touching the fabric of the baby's new clothes, breathing in the quiet hum of a home that was no longer just Kareem's, but maybe, slowly, theirs. But when the first real contraction hit just after midnight, it was sharp, real, unforgiving. Her breath caught in her throat. She doubled over beside the bed, hands bracing on the carved mahogany frame, her body screaming in ways she hadn't expected. Then came the second stronger. She called out, "Amira!" But it wasn't Amira who came. It was Kareem. The door flew open. He stood in the frame, disheveled and alarmed, his normally composed face stripped bare by raw concern. No bodyguard, no assistant, just him, eyes locked on hers. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the room in 2 strides. Lila gritted her teeth, pain shooting through her again. "It's happening," she managed. "The baby's coming." Kareem didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He simply scooped up her hospital bag in one hand and reached for her with the other. "We're going. Right now." The limousine tore through the sleeping city. Rain lashed the windows. Kareem sat beside her in the back seat. His hand wrapped around hers so tightly she could feel the warmth of it anchoring her, grounding her. Between contractions, she stared out the window, watching skyscrapers blur past, lights streaking like stars. Between breaths, she wondered what would happen after the baby arrived. Would this moment be the end of the arrangement, or the beginning of something entirely different? Kareem said little, but he didn't let go. Not once. And for Lila, that silence spoke louder than words. The delivery room. The hospital lights buzzed softly overhead, monitors beeped steadily, nurses bustled in and out, calmly issuing instructions. Kareem had refused to wait outside. "I'm staying," he told the nurse. "She's not doing this alone." And when the worst of the pain hit, when Lila screamed through the contraction that seemed to tear her in half, he was there, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering, "Breathe. You're doing it. You're almost there." He had built empires, signed billion-dollar deals, faced down rooms full of ruthless men, but nothing had prepared him for this. For the sound of that cry, the baby's cry, it shattered him. The doctor held up the newborn, tiny, flushed, wailing in defiance of the world. And as Kareem looked at his son for the first time, his eyes welled. A single tear slipped down his cheek, then another. Not for the pain, not for the pressure. But for the miracle. The raw, overwhelming truth that something he never dared hope for, love, life, family, was now real, crying in front of him. Later. The rain had stopped. The corridors were quiet, the hospital cloaked in the soft hush of 4 a.m. Lila was propped up in bed, a pillow supporting her back, the baby nestled against her chest, skin to skin. His little fingers curled like flower buds against her arm. She was pale, exhausted, but glowing in a way no words could describe. Kareem sat beside her, still in the hospital scrubs the staff had thrown at him in the chaos. In his lap was an envelope. The contract. He looked at it for a long time, then met her eyes. "This doesn't matter anymore." Without fanfare, he tore it in half, then again, and again. The pieces fluttered to the floor like snowflakes, silent, final. "From now on," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion, "you're not bound to me by ink or conditions. You're free." He paused, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, velvet, understated. "But I'm asking." He opened it, revealing a ring so simple it shimmered. "Please choose to stay." Lila stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he added, softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Not because of the child, not because of the mansion, but because I don't want to live another day without knowing I've done this right, for once in my life. I love you, Lila." A sob broke in her chest, part laughter, part relief, part disbelief. "Yes," she whispered, voice catching. "Yes, I will." He leaned forward, kissed her hand. Then kissed the top of their son's tiny head, and finally, for the first time, kissed her. That night, no longer strangers bound by contract, but a man and woman united by something deeper, they sat together under the white hospital lights, their newborn between them. Outside, the first rays of dawn lit up the sky. A new day, a new chapter. A love born not from convenience, but from fire, pain, redemption, and choice. The sun now rose differently over the Blackstone estate. Gone were the long, empty corridors echoing with loneliness. The grand halls were no longer pristine museums of success, but living, breathing spaces filled with laughter, the quiet shuffle of tiny feet, and the aroma of warm breakfasts cooked not by staff, but by Lila herself, humming softly in the kitchen. Kareem had never heard music like that before. For the first time, the mansion felt like a home. Lila's mornings began before dawn. She would wake to the soft cooing of her newborn daughter, bundled in sunlight filtering through sheer curtains. Then she'd tiptoe across the hall to check on Aman, her son from a world so different, yet forever a part of her. Kareem would join her at the table. Shirt sleeves rolled, hair slightly tousled, his laptop always just within reach but rarely opened. He tried. He was learning to put down the weight of his empire, and pick up a bottle, a burp cloth, or simply sit quietly and watch Lila braid Aman's hair with gentle fingers and whispered stories. But some habits die harder than others. Kareem still lived in tension, between who he was trained to be and who he was now becoming. His father had drilled into him that emotion was weakness, that mistakes were punishable, that a man leads through control, not compassion. And though Kareem had made space for love, the echoes of that legacy still haunted him. He watched Aman from a distance sometimes, unsure how to play, how to comfort, how to answer the child's endless whys without reaching for logic instead of heart. He feared not being enough. Aman had a cold, nothing serious but enough to bring a wheeze to his breath and a flush to his cheeks. Lila was by his side constantly, wiping his forehead, whispering lullabies. Kareem stood at the doorway, watching silently, wanting to help but unsure how. Then Aman looked up at him. Big brown eyes, sleepy but curious. "If you were my dad," the boy asked softly, "would you stay if I got really sick?" Kareem froze. The question hit him like a thunderclap. Simple, innocent, and devastating. "Would you stay?" He sat beside the bed carefully. His voice came out lower than usual. Strained. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I would." But the words didn't come easily, because deep down Kareem knew that staying had never been his strength. He had always run, from feeling, from failure, from anything that looked like vulnerability. Yet now, faced with this small boy's question, he realized something with painful clarity. He wasn't just falling in love with Lila. He was being given the chance to be someone's father. And that terrified him more than anything. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet, Kareem found himself in the study, old habits pulling him back to the comfort of solitude. His fingers traced the edge of a photo frame on his desk. Lila, Aman, and the baby, all laughing in the garden. He sat there, staring at it for a long time. Then he whispered to no one, "I don't want to fail them. Not like his own father had failed him. Not again." The next morning, before the sun rose, Kareem was already in Aman's room, kneeling on the rug with toy cars scattered around him. Aman rubbed his sleepy eyes, surprised. "You're up early," the boy mumbled. "You said I should stay when you're sick," Kareem replied. "I thought maybe I could stay even when you're not." Aman grinned, crawling into his lap. And just like that, something shifted. Not everything was perfect. Not yet. Kareem still made mistakes. He still pulled back sometimes when emotions swelled too close. Lila still had fears of losing what she had fought so hard to build. But now, they faced it together. Not as a contract. Not as a compromise. But as a family. Spring rolled in like a gentle breath. Soft blossoms, warm breezes, and the quiet promise of renewal. The Blackstone estate, once a fortress of silence and isolation, now bloomed with life. The garden Kareem once ignored was filled with tiny footprints, hand-planted daisies, and a toddler's giggles that danced with the wind. Inside, laughter lived where tension used to linger. But even in joy, life still held its trials. Kareem's father passed quietly in a foreign hospital, surrounded by nurses but no family. When the call came, Kareem said nothing for a long while. Just stared out the window, hand gripping Lila's. She didn't say a word either. She just stayed. Later that night, Kareem walked into his late father's office. He ran his fingers along the bookshelves, sat at the desk once ruled with iron control, and exhaled. Deep, broken, free. Then he stood, walked out, and never stepped back in. Weeks later, a quiet ceremony unfolded in the backyard. No press, no glamour. Just close friends, a gentle breeze, and 2 barefoot children chasing bubbles behind the bride and groom. Lila wore a simple white dress that floated with the wind. Her son Aman held her hand, while Kareem held their newborn daughter in his arms. "We're not perfect," Kareem whispered as he slid the ring onto her finger. "But I've learned, love doesn't need to be." Tears shimmered in Lila's eyes, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming peace of finally being seen, chosen, and loved, not for what she offered, but for who she was. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Kareem sat on the porch with Aman asleep on his shoulder and Lila curled beside him, humming the same tune she used to sing to her sick son in the slums. "I used to wonder if I'd ever feel safe again," she whispered. Dot. "And now?" he asked. She looked up, smiled softly. "Dot. Now I wonder how I ever lived without this." The camera pulls back, framing the porch, the lights, the trees swaying in the twilight. A quiet home built not on wealth or status, but second chances. A place where healing began. Where a woman who once sold herself to save her child ended up saving a man who didn't know he needed saving. And together, they created something neither of them ever had before. A family.